Hello everyone, welcome. How are you today? I'd like to challenge you to type in the chat box where you're watching me from. So, as you know, my name's Vanessa, and today I am directly live with you all the way from Porto. And I'm pleased to say that that grey cloud of dust is settling and going away. It's absolutely wonderful to see you, and I hope that you are as excited as I am. Now, I have to say hello to a few friends. Hello, Helena, Pedro, Anna, Raquel. So good to see you all here again. Hi, Rosalina from Estremas, Paula from Silvas. Elena, we've just started. Sorry to have kept you, but you know, technology, it has some of these little tricks every now and again. Hi, Palmina from Coimbra, Irmelinda from Milão. This is amazing. We've gone round Portugal in about 2 minutes, really. Verita from Alcanena, hi. And Braga, I see Alberto. Good to see you again. Right, now today I'm going to be speaking to you about something that I feel very, very passionate about, and that is how we can get kids to speak out and to do great. And I think we'll all agree that nowadays speaking is a very important skill. Although, oh, hang on, I cannot forget Viana de Castelo, as Christina is reminding me. Christina, beijinho for you. Right, now coming back to this, as I was saying, I think we'll all agree that speaking is a really important skill nowadays. Because, I mean, it doesn't matter what job the kids decide to do in the future, they will always have to speak. Yet, because of these large classes that we have, it's not always possible to do as much speaking as we'd like to. And you can type in the chat box if you feel this problem as well, right? Sometimes we'd like to do so much more, but with 30 students in the classroom, it isn't easy. And also with cutting down the tempos that we used to have. I mean, I'm thinking of the 8th year when I started teaching, we had 4 tempos. And now we've cut that down to 2. So speaking is one of the skills that is really difficult to do in the classroom. So what my co-authors and I wanted to do was to share our experience with you about how we could actually design a speaking task to engage students and to catch them at being good. And notice I'm saying catch them at being good. In other words, it doesn't matter how fraquinhos they are in terms of English, the task has been designed in such a way as to guarantee that they will be successful. And I've sort of got mixed feelings as I look at the chat box, because half of me is happy that you agree with me, but the other half is really sad that we've lost this and that we have to deal with these kind of difficulties in the classroom. Right, so today I'll be with you for about an hour, so you still have time to go and make a lovely dinner for your family. And this means that we'll only be having 3 objectives. Our first objective will be to take a step back and to think about what it is that we look for in a good speaking task. And this will lead us on to our second objective, which is to think about what is it that we need to do, which little strings do we have to pull to make sure that we can catch the kids at being good. And Pedro, I agree, it is a very challenging task, and there is no magic fairy wand that can just go pling and miracles are solved, right? And finally, I'd like to challenge you or invite you to evaluate some of my students. So could I ask you to type in the chat box if you accept my challenge? Would you please agree to listen to my students and to give them a mark? I mean, I know it's been a long day, but this is just a little favorzinho, right? Hi, Georgina. Good to see you again. Hi, Manuela. Right, now as you're typing that in, perhaps we can then start off by thinking about what is a good speaking task. And I think that to decide and to answer this, we need to take a step back and we need to see the guiding documents that guide us. Theresa, thank you for being so wonderful and evaluating my students. Right, now, which guiding documents do we have? Well, obviously, we'd need to speak about the perfil and the aprendizagens. And I'm not going to take very long doing this, but I do want to show you why I was excited when I saw the perfil when it came to speaking. I mean, there were other things that I wasn't as excited about in terms of the perfil, but I think that when it comes to speaking, the authors really have had a sort of visionary look at this skill. And the reason why I say this is that in the perfil, speaking isn't just one thing in which we evaluate English. The authors understand that speaking is a really complex task. And if it is that complex, they see it almost as a pyramid with three vertices. And so what this means is that all those three vertices have to be intertwined for the speaking task to work well. And I think we've all seen students who've gone up to the front of the class, have excellent English, but don't do that much. You know, the presentation is, well, desensabido, if you know what I mean. So what is the first vertex that the perfil tells us to look at? Well, it's a speaking task. So it comes as no surprise that the first vertex is language, because without language, you can't exactly speak. And I think you'll agree with me on this one. I can see you nodding your heads and smiling all the way from here. Now, that's no surprise, but what was surprising and quite liberating is the fact that the perfil is speaking about different languages and also speaking about L1, bringing L1 into the classroom, right? Now, this for me was absolutely wow, because I did my estágio a few years ago. Let's just say more than 10, right? And when I did my estágio, the first thing that our orientadora said was, you don't speak. That's right. You don't speak Portuguese. No matter what happens in this classroom, you don't bring L1 into the classroom. And at the time, I thought that this was quite strange because, I mean, why would you stop being Portuguese just because you've come into my classroom? So just before the webinar started, you were Portuguese and happy. Now that you are with me in this virtual classroom, through virtual osmosis, have you become English? Well, I wonder if you would even want to become English. So saying that we can just take away your mother language seems to be, well, a little bit over ambitious. And I wonder if you agree with me. If you do, please type in the chat box. So it's groundbreaking that we actually have a document from the Ministry of Education telling us, you know what, it's okay to bring L1 into the classroom and any other language that the students are learning. And I think pretty soon with this dreadful war, we'll be bringing in other languages into the classroom as well. Now, that's the first bit of that first vertex. But the perfil goes a little further. And the second point that it makes is reminding us to train the students to speak in two different formats. Speaking physically when they are having, when they're in front of a real audience, but also speaking digitally. And I think we'll all agree after that awful COVID and teaching online, that teaching online não tem nada a ver with teaching face-to-face in the classroom. It's a whole different set of skills that we need to learn. And the perfil is warning us that this will be something that we'll have to tackle in the classroom. Now, it also speaks about different modalities of speaking. In other words, we don't only speak through words. There are other tools that we can use to speak. And so, of course, we would include some images in our PowerPoints as we do our PowerPoints. And sometimes we'd include sound as well. So that is the first vertex, language, right? Katerina, I totally agree that sometimes explaining things in the student's mother language saves a lot of time and guarantees that everybody understands. And sometimes even comparing and contrasting between L1 and the target language helps the kids understand as well. So I am with you on that one. Right, so what's our second vertex? Well, if our first vertex is language, the second vertex is communication and information. And so what the perfil is telling us is that it isn't enough just to go in front of the class and blah, 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 and say a lot of baboseiras. Because if we do that, pretty soon, nobody is listening. And I'm sure that we've all seen this in our classrooms. On the speaking presentation day, the students listen to how many presentations? About 3. And then they start finding other things to do with their time. And so the perfil is warning us that if we don't want this to happen, we have to have an information gap. In other words, we have to design the kind of speaking task that they will be forced to go online or wherever they want to and do some research to present the audience with information that we don't know. And when we don't know, we listen, much like you are listening to me now. Now, I'm sure that we've all given students tasks in which they had to go online and do information. But then I wonder if what happened to me has happened to you. And if it has, please feel free to type in the chat box. Have you ever seen them come with a papelino that on top says https:// and then Wikipedia, and they start reading what they had found on Wikipedia? Has that happened to you? I can see by your nodding that it has. So the perfil is telling us that it isn't enough for them just to do this research, but a good speaking task will require them to transform this knowledge or this information into knowledge. In other words, they have to personalize it. So we have to design the kind of speaking task in which it isn't quite possible to copy it off the internet simply because it doesn't exist in that format. Filomena, it gives me some consolation that it hasn't only happened to me. And I see Alexander is agreeing, and so is Christina and Pedro, right? So it makes all the sense in the world what the perfil is telling us. Now, it also tells us that when we are communicating, we're going to have to get information from different sources. So it makes sense that we use some images, that we use some quotes, that we use some infographics, and that we use sites that end in .org. So this is another thing that we have to bring into a speaking task. Wikipedia is wonderful as a starting point, but we have to remember that any old Joe blogs can add content onto Wikipedia. So we can't always trust what we read 100% on Wikipedia, and the students need to understand this. So the first vertex, as you can remember, was language, and now the second vertex is communication. So what is the third vertex? Well, that is body language. And I'm sure that you've all seen students who have impeccable English, but then come up and because they are so nervous, hide behind a papelino and simply don't look at the audience and sometimes even read. Their English is impeccable, but their speaking task falls short of what we expect them to because of body language. We've also all seen students speak and say how they are excited to present their speaking, but their body language is saying the opposite. Now, let me demonstrate for you. This is really difficult because I can sort of imagine your smiley faces, but let me take a deep breath and try. You ready? Pay attention to my body language now. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be with you today. This is going to be a wonderful webinar. Do I sound exciting? Is my body language saying the same thing as my words, or are they completely different? Feel free to type in the chat box, all right? Yes, Pedro, I agree. Sometimes that piece of paper is almost hiding their pride in the presentation, right? And body language can also destroy all the hard work that students have done, right? So we need to teach them about not speaking with their backs to the audience or not turning around. You know, when they have a PowerPoint, they speak to the PowerPoint and then just every now and again check that, oh, the teacher's still looking, and continue with the PowerPoint. So all of this is important, and the perfil is warning us about this. Now, the students need to become aware of their body language because, as Elena is saying, body language simply is crucial if we want to establish empathy with the audience. And we all know how crucial that is. Nobody listens to people that they don't like, right? Empathy is absolutely essential, yeah? And as Katerina is saying, with the masks, it makes it even more difficult. So Katerina, if you can't see my face properly, then my body language is going to be even more important, as you are saying. So that is the third vertex of our speaking pyramid. We need students to master language, we need them to master information, and we also need them to master body language. So if the perfil tells us where we need to go, the aprendizagens are going to tell us how we can get there. And I've put up the aprendizagens for the terceiro ciclo and the secundário on the screen so that you can see that there isn't that much of a difference. Well, in terms of content, the students in the terceiro ciclo are speaking about more concrete content. So you'll see that they're speaking about topics like atividades escolares, de lazer, and the world of teenagers that they can relate to. And the reason is that students in the terceiro ciclo are still developing their abstract thinking skills. That is why we only speak about those kind of topics in the secundário and only topics that we have prepared. Otherwise, the students may still not be capable of thinking that far ahead. In terms of language, it comes as no surprise that the language that they'll be using in the terceiro ciclo has to be prepared previously, and it's also very simple language that they use in their day-to-day lives. It is only in the secundário that we can challenge students to go a little bit further and to start using more complex language, right? So, I have a little question to ask you. I wonder if you could type in your answer in the chat box. Do you think that now that we know exactly what kind of speaking task we need to have and the kinds of topics that we develop, do you think that if I announce that we're going to be doing a speaking task tomorrow, it is going to be fantastic? Or do we need a little bit of a danonino, some little bit of help to make sure that we can catch those students at being great? Hi, Virginia, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Margarita is shouting, no, this is not going to be enough. And I have to agree with you, Margarita. We are going to have to go a little bit further. Right? Lena saying, no way, we need to spice this up. And Lena, I agree with you. And I also think that we need to take a step back and think about what is it exactly that we want to catch kids at being good at. So I've put up on the screen a list of things that my co-authors and I look for when we are in the classroom, right? Now, these topics or this criteria is in no specific order. So, it's just been brainstorming that we've had on the slide. And what I'm going to ask you to do, please, is to have a look at this list and to choose the 3 most important criteria that you think we should have. Now, I know it's a really hard choice because all of these things are important. But if we are working with students that have lots of difficulties and that think that English is very challenging, I think you'll agree with me that it is going to be impossible to train them in all these things at the same time, right? Manuel is saying that we need a lot of done in English, right? So please could you choose the three that you think are the most important and type them in the chat box. Now, as you're doing that, let me just tell you that if you choose fluency in the terceiro ciclo, it's not very probable that you'll be choosing accuracy. Because if we're worried about being accurate, we're not going to step outside of our comfort zones, and fluency is going to be affected because we're worried. Right, now Katerina is saying creativity and originality is her top one. Content, body language, I agree. Suzanne is saying pronunciation, fluency, and body language. Maria José is saying body language. It seems to be a big favorite today. Fluency, content, and topic, I totally agree. Theresa, I couldn't agree more. Pronunciation is very important as well. Christina, creativity, range of vocabulary, digital literacy. As you can see, fluency, creativity, content seems to be very popular. Now, before I give you my answers, let me just tell you that it is not possible for you to work on all of these. You have to work on the magic number. And does anybody know what the magic number is? If you do, please can you type in the chat box? How many do you think would be reasonable for us to attack from the very beginning? Pedro, I agree. Creativity, pronunciation, fluency, all important ones. Olga, body language. I have to say that I love you teachers. I don't know how you knew that 3 was the right answer, but that's right. You see, this is why we teachers are so amazing. We know the right answer even when we don't know that it's the right answer. Now, why is 3 the magic number? Well, because there is one para Pai, one para Filho, and one para Espírito Santo. So if 3 is the right answer for God, well, it sure as hell will do in our classrooms. And I think that this is the starting point, starting off by deciding on our priorities. What is the most important skill that we need to develop? And then working on 3 in the primeiro período, adding another one in the segundo período, so spicing it up to 4, and then adding another one in the terceiro período with a total of 5, right? So what this means is that our rubric in the primeiro período will be less ambitious than in the segundo período and of course in the terceiro período. And if you're working in semesters, then what you need to do is have the first half of, the first semester just with 3, and then add in another one, and then have the first bit just with 4 in the second semester, and add in another one afterwards. Right, now, what have I sort of stressed more? I think it's only fair that I show you my answers now that you've shared so kindly your answers with me. Now, you'll see that I make a little bit of a distinction between the terceiro ciclo and the secundário. And in the terceiro ciclo, I'm more worried about the content and the topic. Why? Well, because they may make a wonderful presentation about food, but if we're speaking about free time activities, I expect them to speak about free time activities. And if they don't, then I'm going to say, well, very interesting, but I'm sorry, this is the wrong topic, right? Then I'm very worried about fluency. I don't mind that the students say I didn't went. I understand that they mean I didn't go. I'm more worried that they don't come up in front of the classroom, speak for a minute or 30 seconds, forget a word, and then go into and that dreadful silence. when they just keep quiet and you can see that they're suffering and you want to say something, but you don't know what to say. For me, it is more important that they do fluency than actually accuracy. And if you agree with me, perhaps you can type in the chat box so that I can see that we're on the same page. Now, like a few of you, and I think it was Theresa that mentioned that pronunciation is also very important. And I would agree with you, Theresa, because last week, we had the presentations. And one of my students, Paula, came and told me, Vanessa, you know what? I am the third on the list. Now, when she said this, I will confess that all I wanted to do was laugh. Right? And she kept on saying that she was the third and the third. And I asked her, are you sure? And she said, yes, I'm the third. And then I had to explain to her, Paula, third exists in English, but it doesn't mean the third. The third is number 3. But the third is when you take your dog for a walk and he makes a cocôzinho. That's a third. And when I told her this, you can imagine her reaction. Oh, not the third, the third. So do you see that sometimes pronunciation is really important because it can lead us to understand something that's completely different. Also, when we get into bad habits with pronunciation, it's difficult to shake them. And I think you've all heard children say children and tisha. And it doesn't mean that they can't say teacher. It just means that they have become quite lazy. Now, in the secundário, we're going to go a step further. And here I'm going to start valuing more creativity and originality, like so many of you have said, but also range of vocabulary. I don't want them in the secundário to tell me that it's cool. What do you mean it's cool? There are other adjectives apart from cool. And I certainly don't want them to tell me that they are gonna do something. We don't say gonna in a presentation. Instead, we say, I see that you're nodding your head, going to, right? So these kind of habits, I want them to move on and away from and start getting us and giving us more detail. Right, so now that we know what kind of task we should have, we know the aprendizagens, we know what we want to value, are we ready to go into the classroom and have a fantastic presentation? Or do you think that the students are going to need just a little more help before we can actually catch them at being good? Oh, yes, I can see that you're nodding. We haven't died and gone to teacher heaven yet. It's a little bit more complicated than this, as Pedro was telling us at the beginning of the webinar. So this leads me on to my second objective. Theresa, I agree with you. Not yet. And in our second objective, we're going to be thinking about what is it that we need to do to catch the students at being good. And I would defend that the first thing that we need to do is explain to them with their student brains from the other side of the classroom, this is what good looks like. So it is very important that we go through the task and explain exactly, direitinho, what we want them to do, so that they understand, é isso, this is what the teacher wants me to do in my speaking presentation. And I'd like to now share with you the speaking briefs that my co-authors and I have been developing. So today, to exemplify this, I'd like to show you a task that we've done that I've done with my 8-year students. And what I wanted them to do was to do a spoken interaction task. Now, I've started off with spoken interaction because it's easier to speak with amiguinhos than it is to go by yourself in front of the audience, the whole class, and speak. So that's one of the reasons. But the other reason, if I am to be perfectly honest, is that, well, I have 33 students and I don't really have enough time to evaluate each one by one. So for brevity's sake, I need to join them together. And if you have the same problem, please feel free to type in the chat box, right? This is a very real difficulty that I feel. Right, so to help the students, what we've done is we've come up with a speaking brief. And what I'd like you to do is, as we look at it together, could you please type in the chat box whether you think that this speaking brief will help the students understand exactly what it is that they need to do? And if so, is this going to help me catch them at being great when they present their speaking brief? Now, I think that this is far too small and we don't have time to go and fetch our glasses. So let me zoom this up for you on the screen. And I'm hoping that you can see this just a little bit better. So as you can see, it says speaking presentation brief, and it starts off by inviting the students to check that their presentation has the following criteria. So they'll be working in groups of 3 students, and they will be making a news or a TV interview. And so the roles will be allocated as follows. 1 student will be a presenter, and we will have 2 students as guests. Now, I don't know about you, but just as soon as I explain this, there is always one that puts up their hand and says, Vanessa, can we have 2 presenters and 1 guest? I see this has happened to you as well. To which I answer no, and explain why. If you have 2 presenters and only 1 guest, the poor guest is bombarded with questions from presenter 1 and presenter 2. And so there's no time for that poor student to relax. It is very stressful to be on mode the whole time. But if there are 2 guests and 1 presenter, or 1 interviewer, if you prefer, then I know that the interviewer will ask me a question. I have to be on high alert mode for 30 seconds, but then I'm going to have a bit of a break as the other student is answering. So this is why it has been done in this way. Then you'll also see that we give students a suggestion of topics. It doesn't mean that they can't choose other topics, but these topics will work. And then we explain to them that the content needs to be bem organizadinho. So we need a beginning. And in this beginning, the presenter is going to present the topic of the program and introduce the guests. And then guests 1 and 2 are going to give their opinion on the environmental challenges, and they're going to answer the presenter's questions. And finally, that presenter is going to summarize the most important argument, and then he is going to say goodbye, right? So this is, if you remember the perfil, this is that second vertice. But what about language? Well, Manuela, this is kind of a checklist, right? So I would agree with you. That's exactly what they need. You'll see that we're going to give them a kind of a checklist for language. And I've based this on the most common mistakes that the students make. So all of our sentences have a subject and verb. We include at least 2 to 3 language functions. Now, I don't give them a list of the language functions because throughout the lessons, as we do them in the book, in the top right-hand corner of my board, I always write any important vocabulary or language functions. And then the students write this in their notebooks or in a little caderninho that they have. And this allows them to personalize the language and to choose the language that they want. Then they also need to check that they are pronouncing the words correctly and that they know their speech so that they don't have to stop to think about what they're going to say. So that speech needs to be nice and fluid. And finally, the last vertice is going to be about body language or the audience. And here in the blue square, you can see that we always look the audience in the eye instead of reading, because this isn't a reading exercise. And then we're going to make an interesting presentation. and we're going to have good body language. So we're going to use our hands quite naturally. Now, I'd like to call your attention to this bold here at the bottom of the screen. So you can see here that what I do is I give them a bonus value, not 1 mark, but a whole value if they do these things correctly. And this was absolutely essential because if you motivate weaker students to invest in their speaking presentation, and when they come up in front of the class, it is natural that they're going to make many mistakes. And if you then say, oh, it was very good, but you made so many mistakes, so I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to give you a 2, how motivated do you think they are going to be to try again in the next speaking task? Or is this going to be a really good reason for them to give up? I found that with my students, it was a good reason for them to give up. So I needed something that would guarantee a kind of a danonino. Their language would be a 2, but we saw with the perfil that language is only one of the vertices. So this bold is going to be the other 2 vertices that is going to help me transform a 2 into a 3, or a 3 into a 4, or a 4 into a 5. And if the students already have a 5, then I can give them some puntinhos in the composition. So this is one of my little secrets for success. Right, so time for me to ask you, do you think that these speaking briefs are going to help me catch the students at being great? And could you please type in the chat box? Raquel, you take the prize today. And Gloria too, you've already said, you've already answered. Theresa, don't worry, I will share all of this with you. In a few days, you will be getting the handouts as well as the PowerPoint. Editora will send it to you. And also don't worry, because we have been very engaged in creating some engaging projects. And I can't tell you what these engaging projects are going to have, but I can tell you, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, that they will have a surprise or 2. Right, it's great to see that you agree with me that these are going to help the students. But I warn you, it's not enough just to give them the speaking brief. And when I say give them the speaking brief, you have to examine this in class and explain it like I just explained it to you. If you just give them the papelinho, you know what they're going to do. At the end of the lesson, it's going to be on the floor. They're not going to take it seriously. Now, once they understand the speaking brief and the task, we need to go a step further and explain the rubric. And now, the rubric is really going to help them understand, how does the teacher know that I have been great? So to explain this, and remember, in the primeiro período, I only have 3 topics, in the segundo 4 and in the terceiro 5, I'm going to ask one of the students what mark they would like to have. Now, you're all being very wonderful, shiny stars, but Elena has been participating a lot in the chat box. So, Elena Sunflower, my little Strelina, would you agree to be my student today? And imagine that we were in the classroom and I ask you, Elena, we're going to have a speaking task. Elena, next week, what mark would you like to get? Would you like to get a 3? Would you like to get a 4? Or would you like to get a 5? Elena, can you type in the chat box what mark it is that you would like to get? A 3, a 4, or a 5? Let's see what Elena answers. Right, while Elena is thinking of her mark, Pedro Rato, would you do me a favor, Pedro? And could you please pretend, Pedro, that you only want a 3? So I'll be asking you in a minute which mark you want. I know you're an English teacher and you'd want a 5, but could you just pretend that you want a 3? You see, I knew Elena was going to say 5 because she's my little Sterlina. Okay, Elena, a 5 it is. But Elena, to get a 5, you have to do all of these things here in the rubric direitinho, right? And now I would explain item by item what it is that they have to do. And now I would use the examples that you mentioned before to show the students. If I have presentations from previous years, I show them. When I don't, I just demonstrate myself. Now, Pedro, could you please tell us, Pedro, what mark do you want? Do you also want a 5 like Elena? Or are you willing to humor me and say that, pretend that you just want a 3? Pedro, a 3? Now, if Pedro answers a 3, then I'm going to say, Pedro, don't worry about all of these things. You can spend Saturday playing on your PlayStation because you only need to worry about this column over here. And again, I'm going to explain item by item so that those students who only want a 3 understand what it is that they have to do in their presentation. I never explain 4s because the students very quickly understand that 4 is a bocadinho of 5 and a bocadinho of 3, if that makes sense to you. But it is absolutely essential that you explain the rubric to the students because they do not come with the student's brain. Now, I'm also going to do this because on the day when they come and present, everybody in the classroom evaluates, just as you are going to evaluate my student. And then I open up a document on Google Forms and everybody suggests the mark that they would give that student. So this has 2 advantages I have found. The first advantage is that everybody is paying attention because they know that they will have to go and evaluate the other student. And the second advantage is that it involves students more in the evaluation process. Now, I found that the students give very good marks. Sometimes they're even stricter than I am, if you know what I mean. And the reason why they can do this is that we've examined the speaking brief and we've also examined the rubric. So they know exactly what to evaluate. Now, Pedro is saying that he'd like a 3, but because his mother will take his PlayStation away, it needs to be a 4. Pedro, you've made a very convincing argument. So, Pedro, for a 4, bocadinho of this and bocadinho of that will give you a perfect 4, right? Right. Now, in secondary students, Paula, I don't give them one value, you know, a rubric with 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I give them a rubric with 2 by 2. And I only start from 10 because I assume that nobody wants to fail. So there is one for 10, for 12, for 14, for 16, for 18, and for 20. And that's the way that I found around it. But I would agree it is more difficult in the secundário because the range is bigger, right? Right, now, time for you to evaluate my students. Could you please type in the chat box if you will agree to evaluate them with a teacher's heart? Now, as you're doing that, let me tell you about my students. I haven't chosen the best students for you to see today because the best students are good no matter who teaches them and no matter what the task is. What I've decided to do is to choose those students that when I got them and my colleagues asked, so, you know, which classes are you teaching? And I said, well, I'm teaching oitavo A. They said, oh, coitada, right? In other words, for that class, for those students, English was very challenging. And today I'm going to ask you to listen to 3 of my students. So the first one that has the bonnet is Edgar. When I first met Edgar, he wouldn't even say hello to me in English. He would refuse to say even Tisha. He would speak to me only in Portuguese. Then, in the middle, the presenter is going to be Tomás. Now, Tomás is a student who's very scared of making mistakes. But he thinks he's wonderful. And because he thinks he's wonderful, he doesn't want to make mistakes in front of the others. In other words, he doesn't want to speak English. And finally, the third student that you are going to see today is Martin. Now, you will see that Martin is a very nervous child. Yeah, I mean, you'll see this in his body language. He has trouble focusing. So in the beginning, when I asked these students to do a speaking presentation, guess what their answer was? No. They didn't want to do it, no matter how much I told them that this would be a big part of their mark. And I started off by doing a presentation, which was almost a parrot presentation with Edgar. In other words, he would write his presentation, I would say it, and he would repeat. That was the place to start. And we started off with 30 seconds and then went into 45 seconds into a minute, right? And only after this, after Edgar got the courage to speak on his own, did I start with interacting. Right, now, are you ready to see my students? So remember what the task is today. The task that I would like you to evaluate is a news program in which the presenter is evaluating his guests on the program, and they have to speak about environmental challenges. Don't forget the letras gordinhas, right? So that will allow you to give them an extra valor if you think that they deserve it, okay? I see that you are all ready, so I'm not going to keep you in suspense for much longer. But I do ask you to evaluate these students with a heart, because a year ago they refused to speak any English. Let's see if my speaking brief is going to help you catch them at being good. Here they are. Now, I'm hoping that technology is going to work, and I see that.
Hello everyone. In today's interview, we'll talk with two young activists, Martin and Edgar, about the environmental problems that our planet is facing. So, Martin, do you worry about this happening to our planet?
Yes, I do. I think it is very worrying and that we should take action as soon as possible. What about you, Edgar?
I agree with everything you said, but I also think that we should educate younger people to take action as well.
What do you think is the most serious problem that our planet is facing?
In my opinion, it's the air pollution, because it has many consequences, such as the contamination of the air, that can cause many deaths of humans, animals, and plants. It can also provoke the greenhouse effect.
What about you, Martin?
In my point of view, the most serious problem that our planet is facing is global warming because it can make any other problems like the melting of icebergs and raising the level of sea.
Do you think that we can solve or minimize of these problems?
Yes, we do, by taking simple measures like taking public transport or recycling.
By also using renewable resources and building filters in chimneys of factories. These simple measures can cause a difference in these effects that is affecting our planet.
Are you confident that we can turn this difficult situation around and save the planet?
I think if humans act together and cooperate with each other, these simple measures can save the planet.
What is your opinion on this topic, Edgar?
I think if it will take a few years before we can do so, but I also think that we are capable of doing it.
I agree with both of you and mostly agree with Martin, thinking that global warming is the most dangerous environmental problem. I believe that we can save humanity if we work together. Anyways, thank you for time and I hope to see you again in the future. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Right, now I'm feeling a little nervous because I need to ask you the big question. Is this a disgrace, or did you catch my students at speaking good? Could you type in the chat box? Elena, don't worry, because the webinar has been recorded, so you can watch the part that you missed again. Don't worry. Right, Lena's saying that body language is amazing. Some of it, the pronunciation isn't great, but yes, they have managed to be fluent. Right. Pedro is saying that this would be a good example for other students. Elena is saying, great work, they're speaking. Yes, there are grammar mistakes and pronunciation mistakes. It's not fantastic, but they are communicating. Paula, I have to agree with you. Great evolution. So do you see what I mean by building up a speaking task so that we can catch kids at being good? Now, before we give them feedback, I'm going to ask you if you've ever heard of the sandwich technique for giving feedback. Can you just type into the chat box, Margarita, I love those hearts. Alberto, thank you for saying that they are okay. Susanna, yeah, Edgar, he didn't always look in the eyes of the presenter. But it wasn't bad, right? For a student who wouldn't say anything a year ago, it's quite amazing. Maria, I agree, they did it. Right, Palmina, I'm sorry that you couldn't hear very well, but this was taped because of COVID, and you know that the students don't have studios at home. So they did the best that they could. Anna, you have to show your 11th year pupils these kids so that they can be inspired, or use the rubrics that we've created for you, right? Okay, now I was asking, have you heard about the sandwich technique for giving feedback? Could you just type in the chat box if you have? And if you haven't, I'll gladly explain to you. Right, Suzanne, I agree. They all accomplished the task and they did it quite beautifully. And this is important so that we have honest feedback for them. Okay, I see Elena hasn't. Don't worry, Elena, I'll explain for you. Now, how do you make a sandwich? Well, to make a really good sandwich, you need a good slice of pão. And there's a lot of wonderful bread here in Portugal. Then you need the filling, anything that you like, perhaps some queijinho or presunto or both if you're greedy like me. And then to top things off, you need another slice of pão. So this is how we are going to give feedback as well. We're going to start off by telling the students one thing that they did well in the lesson. And this is very important. One thing that they did well in this speaking task, so that their egos are built, and we can move into point 2, which is one thing that they should work on. And then finally, one thing that they should repeat. So I wonder if I could ask you to type in your feedback in the chat box. Could we please think of the student which is called Marti? You know, the roly-poly one that was doing this in his chair all the time? You know what I mean, right? Marti. So Marti wasn't very good at sitting still in his chair, but there was something that Marti was good at. Could you type in your chat box what it was? So I agree with you, Lisa. He was a bit insecure, but there was something that he was good at, right? What was it? Was he reading? I think you'll agree with me that there was no papelinho. He'd learned his whole presentation off by heart. Now, yes, the rhythm wasn't the best and the intonation, but I think you'll agree that his presentation was fantastic. So Sylvia, like you, I would say, Marti, I was impressed. You didn't read at all. And Christina's adding, you were speaking the whole way through. You were really fluent. Well done. Now, as he's feeling a little more confident, I'm going to think about one thing that he should work on. Now, be careful. I'm not going to tell him articles. Fix your articles. Yeah, well, it's true that he doesn't use them, but articles are really difficult to master. Even students who have a more advanced level of English make mistakes. So I'm going to choose a bit of feedback that it is doable. It is possible that he fixes this for the next presentation. And you've all mentioned his body language. His body language isn't very great. So what I would do is speak about body language. Marti, you can't choose an interactive chair. You need to choose one of those basic chairs that don't let you roly-poly from one side to the other. And Martin, you can't give yourself leg massages while you are speaking. Não dá, not in a speaking presentation. And now this is the one thing that Martin can actually focus on for the next presentation, so I have good feedback to give him and I can catch him at being great. And then finally, I'm going to speak about one thing that he should repeat the next time. So I don't know about you, but did you notice the language that he used? Perhaps you could type into the chat box. Christina is laughing at my interactive chair. But Christina, it was really interactive. Did you see it? Never stopped. Right, now what about language? What did you notice? Did you notice that he used language functions? In my opinion, I think that. Did you notice the kind of vocabulary that he used to speak about the environmental problems? All of these things would be things that I would stress. Marti, it was wonderful to listen to you. It was almost like being in England again. I think that. And that vocabulary that you used. Well done. Do this again in a next speaking presentation. So after this kind of feedback, how do you think that Martin is feeling? Do you think that he might consider doing another presentation the next time I give him one? Or do you think that he thinks English is impossible? This is what I mean by setting up the task so that we can catch the kids at being great. And Pedro is agreeing that there's a big chance that he'll be able to do this next time. So, what is the secret of a great speaking presentation? Well, I would defend that it starts with a task brief. Then I would add that you need a clear rubric. And then if you put the two together, you have a good chance of catching the kids at being great. But I have two more secrets that I'd like to share with you. Would you like to know my secrets? Well, the first secret is that on the lesson before the speaking presentation, so let's imagine that the speaking presentation is on Friday and our last lesson is on Wednesday. Then on the Wednesday, I save the last 15 to 20 minutes for dress rehearsal. And what I do is invite all the groups to do their speaking presentation for at least two other groups, right? Not to me, because I need to write the sumário and sometimes even a participação, but for the other groups. And because the other groups have seen the speaking brief and because they've seen the rubric, they are able to give the groups that they're watching feedback that they can work on before the real thing, right? So they get 2 to 3 bits of feedback. And then on the day, when they come into the classroom, and they always send me their PowerPoints by email. As I'm getting them all on the desktop, I give them gym time. So what does this mean? On the day, they have to do their speaking presentation for at least another 2 groups, so that when they come and stand in front of the class, they've already practiced at least 4 times. And this is the 5th time, 5th to 6th, if they've managed to do 3 times. In other words, speaking is easy for them at that moment. So, you know what I'm going to say next, don't you? Glory, glory. This is just the beginning of an engaging speaking story in your classroom. Thank you so much for having come online today. It has been absolutely wonderful to see so many of you and so many friends. And I'd like to invite you to attend next week's webinar, in which we are going to flip the classroom and give you a few secrets to design some fantastic tasks, and also to come and see the babies in about a month's time, because we've been preparing lots of surprises for you, which I'm absolutely forbidden to tell you more about. But let me just say that it is going to be an engaging treat, if you know what I mean. So, all the way from Porto, a very, very big hug from me to you, and a big thank you to Porto Editora, who's made all of this possible. Without you, we wouldn't have been able to spend this wonderful hour together. I hope that you've enjoyed the webinar as much as I have, and I ask you to keep safe and to look after yourself, because our students need great teachers just like you. Bye-bye, everyone. Beijinho. Bye.